Have you ever noticed that curious contradiction? How the act supposedly meant to release often seems to bind more tightly. It's one of those paradoxes hiding in plain sight, so deeply embedded in Christian psychology that we rarely pause to question it. Consider the pattern. I forgive you somehow places the forgiver above the forgiven. I'm turning the other cheek quietly establishes moral superiority. I'm letting go of your offense mysteriously creates a new relationship of indebtedness. There's something almost suspicious about this correlation between professed forgiveness and experienced dominance. Why would an act supposedly centered on liberation so frequently coincide with a subtle form of subjugation? The contradiction extends beyond individual psychology into religious language itself. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, establishing a direct transactional relationship with divine judgment. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do, positioning the forgiver as morally enlightened compared to the ignorant offender. If you don't forgive others, God won't forgive you, creating explicit conditional relationship between horizontal and vertical forgiveness. These aren't random spiritual insights, but follow a systematic pattern. Forgiveness is consistently framed not merely as release, but as moral transaction that positions the forgiver above the forgiven. There's something almost too convenient about this framing, as if forgiveness functions less as genuine liberation and more as sophisticated mechanism for establishing moral dominance. This paradox becomes even more intriguing when we notice how consistently Christian forgiveness coincides with an unspoken expectation of gratitude from the forgiven. The offender who must acknowledge their debt to the gracious forgiver. The sinner who must appreciate the merciful Christian who has released them from guilt. The transgressor who must recognize the moral elevation of the one who has forgiven them. There's something curious about this pattern, as if forgiveness functions not to eliminate moral hierarchy but simply to reverse it, not to truly release the offense but to transform it into different kind of bond. The uncomfortable question lurking beneath this pattern is disturbing. What if Christian forgiveness isn't primarily about liberation, but about establishing moral superiority? What if the act most celebrated for releasing offenses actually represents a sophisticated mechanism for transforming them into different kind of power relationship? One where the forgiver, rather than the offender, now occupies the dominant position. What if forgiveness functions not to truly overcome harm, but merely to reposition the forgiver above the forgiven through subtle form of moral crediting and debiting? This isn't merely an academic question. It strikes at the heart of Christian ethics, challenging our most basic assumptions about spiritual virtue and moral development. If forgiveness functions not primarily as genuine release, but as disguised form of moral domination, how might this distort believers' relationship to themselves, to others, and to the divine? What might become possible if we distinguished between authentic overcoming of harm and the psychological mechanism that transforms offense into moral credit? And who better to guide us through this uncomfortable territory than a man who spent his life examining the psychological foundations of religious virtue? A philosopher whose commitment to intellectual honesty led him to question not just specific moral teachings, but the very psychological mechanisms by which virtues establish and maintain their power. A thinker who dared to ask whether our most celebrated spiritual qualities might actually be serving very different psychological purposes than we imagine. What if I told you that over a century ago, one of history's most penetrating minds uncovered this pattern and traced its implications to their unsettling conclusion? A thinker who recognized that behind Christianity's celebration of forgiveness lurks something much less divine. A sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms offense into moral credit, harm into spiritual leverage, inability to forget into power to dominate. What might we learn by following his investigation? Why do we find it so difficult to question the psychological function of forgiveness? Could it be that entire moral systems have benefited from keeping these functions hidden? What if the ultimate spiritual insight isn't cultivating perfect forgiveness but recognizing the disguised dominance that often motivates it? The answers to these questions might challenge your most basic assumptions about Christian virtue, spiritual development, and religious psychology. They offer a perspective on forgiveness not as genuine liberation, but as sophisticated psychological mechanism. Perhaps the most effective disguise the will to power has ever invented. Are you ready to follow where they lead? There's a striking pattern in Christian forgiveness that becomes visible once you start looking for it. A pattern so consistent it can't be dismissed as coincidence. It emerges in the peculiar correlation between professed release of offense and experienced moral superiority, between verbal absolution and psychological elevation, between apparent letting go and actual holding on through different mechanism. This pattern doesn't appear randomly. It follows a specific and predictable trajectory, revealing itself most clearly in how forgiveness functions not to eliminate moral hierarchy, but simply to reverse it, transforming the offender's position of power into the forgiver's moral dominance. Consider how Christian forgiveness typically manifests. The forgiver emphasizes their own magnanimity, while highlighting the offender's transgression. The pardoning Christian speaks of releasing the offense, while simultaneously preserving it as occasion for moral credit. The forgiving believer professes to let go, while actually maintaining the memory of harm as foundation for new relationship of moral indebtedness. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Forgiveness coincides not with genuine liberation, but with transformation of offense into different kind of bond, one where the forgiver now occupies the superior position. What makes this pattern truly revealing isn't its occasional appearance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse expressions of Christian spirituality. The specific theological details may change, the cultural expressions may shift, but the psychological function remains strikingly consistent. Forgiveness transforms the original offense into moral credit that positions the forgiver above the forgiven, converting harm into different kind of power relationship where the original victim now holds moral advantage. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. This pattern becomes even more intriguing when we notice how it manifests in religious language. Christian teachings consistently frame forgiveness not merely as release, but as moral transaction with profound spiritual implications. If you forgive others, your heavenly Father will forgive you. But if you refuse to forgive others, your Father will not forgive your sins. The pattern continues. Forgiveness is presented not simply as genuine letting go, but as strategic positioning with significant consequences. Not merely as spontaneous release, but as moral transaction that determines one's spiritual standing. This framing suggests function beyond mere liberation, transaction that converts offense into different kind of power relationship. The anomaly extends beyond language into social dynamics. Those celebrated for Christian forgiveness often occupy positions of remarkable moral authority within religious communities, speaking with surprising certainty about spiritual matters, making confident judgments about others' virtue, displaying pronounced sense of moral elevation. The pattern repeats. Forgiveness coincides not with genuine humility, but with subtle form of pride, not with true equality, but with inverted hierarchy, where the forgiver now stands above the forgiven. What's particularly striking about this pattern is how rarely we acknowledge it explicitly. We discuss forgiveness, mercy, and pardon at length, but we seldom examine this specific correlation, how consistently Christian forgiveness functions not to eliminate moral hierarchy, but to reverse it in favor of the forgiver. It's as if we've collectively agreed not to notice how perfectly forgiveness serves to transform offense into moral credit, harm into spiritual leverage, inability to forget into power to dominate through different mechanism. And that's where our investigation truly begins, with the recognition that Christian forgiveness might be serving psychological functions quite different from those explicitly claimed. What if this celebrated virtue functions not primarily as genuine liberation from offense, but as sophisticated mechanism for transforming harm into moral credit? What if forgiveness represents not the absence of resentment, but its most ingenious disguise, resentment's most effective strategy for maintaining itself while appearing to be its opposite? This is the question that haunted a 19th century philosopher whose insights into religious psychology were so profound, so disturbing, that they continue to challenge us today. A man who dared to ask whether Christianity's most celebrated virtue might actually be serving very different psychological purposes than we imagine. What did Friedrich Nietzsche discover about this strange relationship between forgiveness and power? And why does his discovery remain so unsettling and potentially liberating more than a century later. What if forgiving is not releasing but dominating through different mechanism? This question leads us to Nietzsche's disturbing insight. Forgiveness is the secret pleasure of one who never forgets the offense. In the autumn of 1887, Friedrich Nietzsche was working on what would become one of his most penetrating works, On the Genealogy of Morals. At 43, he was entering the most productive period of his philosophical career, though still largely unrecognized by the intellectual establishment. His health was deteriorating. Severe migraines, stomach ailments, and failing eyesight regularly confined him to darkened rooms for days. He lived in near isolation, moving between cheap lodgings across Europe as his meager pension allowed. By conventional standards, Nietzsche's life appeared to be defined by failure and suffering. It was within this context of physical pain and public indifference that Nietzsche formulated his most disturbing insights about the psychology of Christian virtue. His personal circumstances provided a unique vantage point from which to examine religious psychology. Having grown up as the son of a Lutheran pastor, with both grandfathers also pastors, Nietzsche had intimate knowledge of Christian virtue from the inside. He was raised in an environment saturated with talk of forgiveness, mercy, and pardon, where these qualities were consistently presented as supreme spiritual ideals. Yet his own intellectual journey had led him to question whether these celebrated virtues might be serving psychological functions quite different from those explicitly acknowledged. What made Nietzsche's perspective on Christian forgiveness especially valuable wasn't merely his philosophical brilliance, but the convergence of his personal experience with his intellectual journey. Here was a man who had been immersed in Christian teaching from childhood, yet possessed the rare psychological insight to question its hidden functions. Each day, as he navigated both his physical pain and his intellectual isolation, Nietzsche lived the very question at the heart of his philosophy. Might the virtues most celebrated by mainstream religion actually represent sophisticated psychological mechanisms serving purposes quite different from their explicit claims? Could the forgiveness, praised by conventional morality, actually disguise a peculiar form of power, the power of moral superiority? During his periods of relative physical relief, Nietzsche would write in small notebooks, developing what would become one of his most disturbing insights: that Christian forgiveness functions not primarily as genuine liberation from offense, but as sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms harm into moral credit, converting offense into different kind of power relationship, where the forgiver now occupies the superior position. Behind the mask of the forgiving believer, he suggested, often lurks a particular form of resentment, more insidious precisely because it presents itself as resentment's opposite. In his notebooks from this period, filled with his increasingly aphoristic writing style, Nietzsche began to articulate a disturbing hypothesis: that Christian forgiveness emerged not primarily from genuine overcoming of harm, but from psychological need. Specifically, the need to transform position of weakness into position of moral superiority. As he would later write in On the Genealogy of Morals, the slave revolt in morality begins when ressentiment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. This wasn't mere provocative rhetoric, but recognition of what Nietzsche saw as Christianity's fundamental psychological project: the transformation of weakness into virtue, impotence into moral superiority, inability to respond directly to harm into power to dominate through different mechanism. What made this insight especially powerful was that it didn't come from anti-religious animus, but from Nietzsche's meticulous analysis of how Christian virtue actually functions in human psychology. He noticed something that few had articulated before: how consistently forgiveness coincides not with genuine liberation, but with transformation of offense into moral credit, not with true release, but with preservation of harm as foundation for new relationship of indebtedness. This wasn't mere coincidence, but revealed something profound about the psychological function of this celebrated virtue. Not eliminating resentment, but disguising it. Not overcoming the will to power, but expressing it through different channel. It was this recognition of the hidden psychological function of Christian forgiveness that gave Nietzsche's moral critique its unusual penetration and emotional force. He wasn't merely rejecting religious virtue as misguided. He was uncovering what he saw as its hidden psychological purpose. Not genuine liberation, but disguised dominance. Not overcoming of resentment, but its transformation into more subtle, more socially acceptable, more spiritually sanctioned form. As he would write in The Antichrist, the Christian conception of God, God as God of the sick, God as a spider, God as spirit, is one of the most corrupt conceptions of the divine ever attained on earth. This wasn't mere polemic, but recognition that Christian virtues function as integral elements of sophisticated psychological system that transforms weakness into moral superiority through values like forgiveness. This is the context from which Nietzsche would develop his unsettling analysis of how forgiveness functions psychologically within Christian morality. It wasn't merely a critique of specific virtues, but a profound insight into how religious psychology operates beneath its explicit claims. What evidence did Nietzsche find for this disturbing pattern? And what implications might it have for our understanding of forgiveness, resentment, and the possibility of authentic overcoming of harm beyond the moral transaction of Christian pardon? Nietzsche's first evidence for his hypothesis came through his meticulous examination of Christian texts and teachings. With the careful eye of a trained philologist, he traced how forgiveness was presented across Christian tradition. What he discovered was a striking pattern that few had bothered to notice. The systematic framing of forgiveness not merely as release, but as moral transaction with profound spiritual implications, not simply as letting go, but as positioning with significant consequences for both forgiver and forgiven. In On the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887, Nietzsche offered his initial observations of this pattern. One adopts punishment as tradition. One practices and defends it as tradition. One believes in it and feels it as if it represented justice itself. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that Christian forgiveness functions within broader system of moral bookkeeping, system that positions the forgiver as creditor who may choose to cancel debt but still maintains fundamental framework of moral accounting. The very structure of Christian forgiveness preserves rather than eliminates the original offense by transforming it into occasion for moral credit. What made this observation so penetrating wasn't merely identifying Christianity's emphasis on forgiveness, which many had acknowledged before, but recognizing its psychological function, how it systematically transforms offense into moral credit, harm into spiritual leverage, inability to forget into power to dominate through different mechanism. Christian forgiveness doesn't simply release the offense. It reconfigures the moral landscape to position the forgiver above the forgiven. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Simultaneously pardons and establishes profound moral asymmetry between enlightened forgiver and ignorant offender. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in how Christian teachings frame the relationship between human forgiveness and divine judgment. From Jesus' parable of the unforgiving servant to explicit statements like, "If you don't forgive others, your Father won't forgive you," Christian tradition consistently presents forgiveness not merely as spontaneous release, but as strategic positioning with significant spiritual consequences. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Forgiveness functions as a sophisticated form of moral transaction that determines one's standing in divine economy, transforming apparent release of others into mechanism for securing one's own spiritual position. This insight gained further support from Nietzsche's analysis of how forgiveness functions in religious psychology. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "The noble human being honors himself as one who is powerful, also as one who has power over himself, who knows how to speak and be silent, who delights in being severe and hard with himself, and respects all severity and hardness." By contrast, he observed how Christian morality valorizes different approach. The salvation of the soul. In plain words, the world revolves around me. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that forgiveness often disguises particular form of self-centeredness, one that positions the forgiver at center of moral drama, transforming apparent selflessness into subtle form of spiritual self-interest. Perhaps most compelling was Nietzsche's observation of how forgiveness manifests in believers' actual psychological experience. He noted how consistently the forgiving Christian maintains sense of moral superiority despite professed humility, judging the forgiven with remarkable confidence. speaking about divine mercy with unexpected authority, preserving clear memory of the offense despite claims to have released it. The pattern was consistent. Forgiveness coincides not with genuine liberation, but with transformation of offense into moral credit, not with true release, but with preservation of harm as foundation for new relationship of indebtedness. This observation allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that Christian forgiveness functions not primarily as genuine liberation from offense, but as sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms harm into moral credit. As he writes in The Will to Power, Christian morality is a command. Its origin is transcendent. It is beyond all criticism, all right to criticism. It has truth only if God is truth. It stands or falls with faith in God. This isn't mere theological observation, but recognition that forgiveness within Christian framework operates as divine command that establishes particular moral economy where apparent release of offense actually preserves it as foundation for new relationship of power. What makes this evidence so compelling isn't any single instance, but the consistent pattern across Christian texts, teachings, and psychological manifestations. The same correlation appears again and again. Forgiveness coincides not with genuine liberation, but with transformation of offense into moral credit, not with true release, but with preservation of harm as foundation for new relationship of indebtedness. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental. But if Nietzsche's initial observations revealed this pattern, his deeper investigation would uncover something even more profound: how the psychological mechanism of forgiveness emerges from what he called ressentiment, the particular condition of weakness that cannot respond directly to harm, and therefore creates values that transform this weakness into different kind of strength, moral superiority. As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he discovered that the psychological function of Christian forgiveness wasn't merely incidental, but essential to what he called slave morality, a moral system that emerges from the condition of weakness and operates by transforming impotence into virtue, weakness into moral superiority, inability to respond directly to harm into power to dominate indirectly. The specific theological details might change across Christian traditions, but the basic psychological pattern remained consistent. Forgiveness functions not primarily as genuine liberation, but as sophisticated mechanism for converting weakness into different kind of strength, moral authority. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche expanded this analysis. The beginning of the slave's revolt in morality occurs when ressentiment itself turns creative and gives birth to values. The ressentiment of those beings who, denied the proper response of action, compensate for it only with imaginary revenge. This passage reveals Nietzsche's understanding that virtues like forgiveness emerge from particular psychological condition, specifically the condition of weakness that cannot respond directly to harm and therefore creates moral framework that transforms this weakness into different kind of strength. As he further explains, while every noble morality develops from a triumphant affirmation of itself, slave morality from the outset says no to what is outside, what is different, what is not itself, and this no is its creative deed. This observation points to how forgiveness functions not simply as release of harm, but as moral judgment that positions the forgiver above the forgiven, transforming apparent acceptance into sophisticated form of negation. What made this insight especially powerful was Nietzsche's recognition that this psychological mechanism wasn't merely theoretical, but revealed itself in the lived experience of Christian morality. In Beyond Good and Evil, he writes, "Whoever fights with monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster in the process. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you." This enigmatic statement points to his understanding that forgiveness often functions not to overcome the cycle of harm, but to perpetuate it through different mechanism, transforming direct retaliation into moral condemnation disguised as virtue, converting physical or social dominance into spiritual superiority, replacing overt hostility with subtle form of power that operates through apparent renunciation of power itself. Nietzsche began to see that this pattern revealed something essential about how Christian morality functions psychologically, not primarily to promote genuine reconciliation, but to transform power relationships through sophisticated moral inversion. By celebrating forgiveness as supreme virtue while simultaneously presenting it as divine command with significant spiritual consequences, Christianity effectively established moral framework that converts position of weakness into position of strength through values that privilege psychological states naturally available to those without direct power. The forgiver who cannot respond directly to harm transforms this impotence into moral credit that positions them above the forgiven, converting inability to retaliate into spiritual superiority disguised as virtue. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most disturbing insights, that Christian forgiveness represents not the absence of resentment, but its most ingenious disguise. As he writes in On the Genealogy of Morals, it was the Jews who, with awe-inspiring consistency, dared to invert the aristocratic value equation, good, noble, powerful, beautiful, happy, beloved of God, and to hang on to this inversion with their teeth, the teeth of the most abysmal hatred, the hatred of impotence, saying, the wretched alone are the good, the poor, impotent, lowly alone are the good, the suffering, deprived, sick, ugly alone are pious, alone are blessed by God. This passage reveals Nietzsche's understanding that forgiveness functions as integral element of sophisticated moral inversion, system that transforms natural human responses into their apparent opposites, converting desire for revenge into virtuous release, transforming inability to harm into moral choice to forgive, repositioning the powerless as spiritually superior precisely through their apparent renunciation of power. The pattern became increasingly clear. Christian forgiveness functions not primarily as genuine liberation from offense, but as sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms harm into moral credit. The forgiving believer hasn't truly released the offense, but merely transformed it into different kind of bond, converting initial harm into moral debt, where the forgiven now owes gratitude to the magnanimous forgiver. The merciful Christian hasn't truly overcome resentment, but merely disguised it behind mask of virtue, transforming inability to respond directly to harm into moral superiority that dominates through different mechanism. This insight allowed Nietzsche to recognize something that few had articulated before, that the psychological appeal of forgiveness lies precisely in its capacity to transform weakness into strength without requiring actual change in power relations. As he writes in The Will to Power, happiness is no reward of virtue but is virtue itself. Similarly, pain is not the cause of repentance, but repentance itself. This observation points to how forgiveness functions not simply as response to harm, but as sophisticated repositioning within moral landscape. Transformation that converts apparent release into subtle form of judgment, seeming liberation into different kind of bond. What implications might this understanding have for our conception of forgiveness, resentment, and the possibility of authentic overcoming of harm? And what might it reveal about spiritual development beyond the moral transaction of Christian pardon? Nietzsche's investigation was leading him toward a disturbing conclusion, that Christian forgiveness represents not the absence of resentment, but its most sophisticated disguise, resentment's most ingenious strategy for maintaining itself while appearing to be its opposite. As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a striking pattern emerged across diverse aspects of Christian morality. The psychological mechanism of forgiveness wasn't isolated to particular theological details or specific religious practices, but appeared with remarkable consistency throughout the entire moral system. The pattern was clear. Forgiveness functions not primarily as genuine liberation from offense, but a sophisticated mechanism for transforming harm into moral credit, converting initial damage into different kind of bond, where the forgiver now occupies position of spiritual superiority disguised as virtuous humility. On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche articulated this pattern with characteristic clarity. To be incapable of taking one's enemies, one's accidents, even one's misdeeds seriously for very long, that is the sign of strong, full natures in whom there is an excess of the power to form, to mold, to recuperate, and to forget. Such a man shakes off with a single shrug many vermin that eat deep into others. Here alone, genuine love of one's enemies is possible, supposing it to be possible at all on earth. This passage reveals his recognition that authentic overcoming of harm emerges not from moral framework that transforms offense into opportunity for spiritual credit, but from natural vitality that truly moves beyond injury. Genuine strength that doesn't need to forgive because it has actually forgotten. Natural power that doesn't require moral transaction because it has genuinely overcome. The pattern revealed itself in how Christianity approaches divine forgiveness and human obligation. Rather than presenting divine pardon as genuine liberation, Christian theology consistently establishes sophisticated transaction. God forgives but demands belief, worship, and moral compliance in return. Christ's sacrifice creates framework where forgiveness becomes conditional gift rather than true release. Divine mercy establishes eternal obligation enforced by spiritual consequences. The pattern continued. Forgiveness functions not as genuine liberation, but as moral transaction with implicit expectations, not as true release, but as different kind of bond governed by spiritual bookkeeping. In Christian approaches to interpersonal forgiveness, the same pattern appeared. Rather than presenting pardon as natural human possibility, Christian morality consistently frames it as spiritual achievement with significant consequences. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, establishes direct correlation between horizontal and vertical forgiveness. If you don't forgive others, your Father won't forgive you creates explicit conditionality, where apparent release of others determines one's own spiritual fate. Love your enemies, bless those who curse you, positions the forgiver as morally superior to those operating from natural human responses. The pattern persisted. Forgiveness functions not as genuine liberation, but as sophisticated moral positioning within divine economy. Perhaps most revealing was how this pattern manifested in the psychological experience of Christian forgiveness. The forgiver who prominently announces their pardon while subtly reminding others of the offense. The merciful believer who speaks of release while preserving clear memory of the harm. The pardoning Christian who expects gratitude from the forgiven as acknowledgement of moral debt. The pattern repeated. Forgiveness functions not to truly eliminate the offense, but to transform it into different kind of bond, where the forgiver now occupies position of moral creditor who has graciously cancelled debt that nevertheless remains acknowledged within the relationship. What made this pattern so powerful wasn't any single instance, but its remarkable consistency across diverse aspects of Christian morality. Whether in theological frameworks, interpersonal dynamics, or psychological experiences, the same mechanism operated. Forgiveness functions not to truly eliminate harm, but to transform it into different kind of relationship where the forgiver occupies position of moral superiority disguised as virtuous humility. As Nietzsche writes in The Antichrist, what is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that a resistance is overcome. This passage reveals his understanding that Christian forgiveness often functions contrary to this natural human psychology, not enhancing vital power, but constraining it within moral framework that transforms direct responses into their apparent opposites. This recognition led Nietzsche to one of his most penetrating insights, that Christian forgiveness represents not the absence of resentment, but its most ingenious disguise. The forgiving believer hasn't truly overcome the offense, but merely transformed it into moral credit, converting initial harm into sophisticated form of spiritual leverage, where the forgiven now occupies position of debtor to the magnanimous forgiver. The pardoning Christian hasn't genuinely released resentment, but disguised it behind mask of virtue, transforming inability to respond directly to harm into moral superiority that dominates through different mechanism. As this pattern became increasingly clear, Nietzsche began to recognize its profound implications. What if Christian forgiveness functions not primarily as genuine liberation from offense, but as sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms harm into moral credit? What if the celebrated virtue of pardon represents not the absence of resentment, but its most ingenious disguise, resentment's most effective strategy for maintaining itself while appearing to be its opposite? What if authentic overcoming of harm might be possible beyond the moral transaction of Christian forgiveness? This recognition wasn't merely academic observation, but profound challenge to how we understand forgiveness, resentment, and spiritual development. If Christian pardon functions primarily as disguised form of moral superiority rather than genuine liberation, what might become possible if we sought authentic overcoming beyond the sophisticated transaction of traditional virtue? What form of reconciliation might emerge if we distinguished between genuine release and the moral credit disguised as virtue? That characterizes its Christian formulation. As we continue our investigation, we'll explore the deeper implications of Nietzsche's discovery. What does it mean for our understanding of forgiveness, resentment, and the possibility of authentic overcoming beyond the moral transaction of Christian pardon? And what might it reveal about spiritual development beyond the disguised resentment of conventional virtue? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery reach far beyond academic religious criticism into the very heart of how we understand forgiveness, resentment, and spiritual development. If Christian pardon functions not primarily as genuine liberation, but as sophisticated psychological mechanism that transforms harm into moral credit, then addressing this insight requires more than theological refinement. It demands fundamental reconsideration of how we approach reconciliation, not merely revised understanding of forgiveness, but transformed conception of authentic overcoming beyond the moral transaction and disguised resentment of conventional virtue. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche explored these implications through his concept of the three metamorphoses of the spirit, from camel to lion to child. The camel represents the spirit that bears the weight of traditional morality, including virtues like forgiveness that transform harm into moral obligation. The lion represents the courage to say no to these imposed moral frameworks, creating space for authentic values to emerge. The child represents the capacity for genuine creation, for establishing relationship to life beyond the moral transactions of traditional virtue. This framework reveals Nietzsche's profound insight. Moving beyond the disguised resentment of conventional forgiveness requires not just theological reinterpretation, but fundamental transformation of how we relate to harm, offense, and reconciliation. The first profound implication is psychological. If Christian forgiveness often functions as disguised form of moral superiority, authentic overcoming requires psychological honesty beyond conventional virtue. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, "Whoever has deeply suffered suspects all forgiveness." This isn't mere cynicism, but recognition that genuine reconciliation emerges not from moral framework that transforms harm into spiritual transaction, but from honest acknowledgement of both the injury and the natural human responses to it, not through disguised resentment of conventional forgiveness, but through authentic engagement with harm beyond religious obligation to pardon. The second implication is spiritual. If Christian forgiveness represents not the absence of resentment, but its most ingenious disguise, authentic reconciliation might require a different approach altogether. As Nietzsche suggests in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, "I tell you, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." This isn't mere poetic flourish, but recognition that genuine overcoming emerges not from moral framework that transforms natural responses into their apparent opposites, but from authentic engagement with the full spectrum of human experience. Not through sophisticated disguise of resentment behind mask of virtue, but through honest integration of both harm and healing beyond the moral transaction of conventional forgiveness. The third implication is ethical. If traditional morality transforms offense into opportunity for spiritual credit, authentic reconciliation requires values beyond moral frameworks that convert harm into transaction. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, "What is done out of love always takes place beyond good and evil." This isn't rejection of ethics, but recognition that genuine healing might emerge not from moral obligation enforced by spiritual consequences, but from natural human capacity beyond religious framework, not through transaction governed by divine bookkeeping, but through authentic connection unmediated by expectations of gratitude or acknowledgement of moral debt. Perhaps the most profound implication is liberatory. If conventional forgiveness functions primarily as psychological mechanism that disguises resentment behind mask of virtue, authentic overcoming might require liberation from the sophisticated moral transaction of traditional pardon. As Nietzsche writes in Twilight of the Idols, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." This isn't mere motivational slogan, but recognition that authentic healing emerges not through virtues that transform harm into moral credit, but through direct engagement with injury that genuinely incorporates and moves beyond it, not through disguised resentment of forgiveness, but through transformation that truly leaves the offense behind without need for moral positioning or spiritual bookkeeping. What does this mean for our understanding of forgiveness, resentment, and spiritual development? If Christian pardon functions primarily as disguised form of moral superiority rather than genuine liberation, what might become possible if we sought authentic overcoming beyond the sophisticated transaction of traditional virtue? What form of reconciliation might emerge if we distinguished between genuine release and the moral credit disguised as virtue that characterizes its Christian formulation?
As Nietzsche suggests, the path toward authentic healing begins not with more perfect cultivation of conventional forgiveness, but with psychological honesty beyond the disguised resentment of traditional morality. The liberation from sophisticated moral transaction of Christian pardon might open possibilities for reconciliation that neither traditional believers nor critics have fully explored. Possibilities emerging from what Nietzsche saw as genuine strength that doesn't need to forgive,
because it has actually moved beyond. The pattern Nietzsche uncovered extends beyond specific theological details into what might be called a conspiracy of virtue, a collective cultural agreement to transform natural human responses into their apparent opposites through sophisticated moral frameworks. This isn't a conscious conspiracy in the crude sense, but rather a cultural evolution driven by what Nietzsche called ressentiment, the psychological condition of weakness that cannot respond directly to harm, and therefore creates values that transform this weakness into different kind of strength through moral inversion. On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche traced how this conspiracy evolved through the historical development of Western morality. What began as direct expression of natural human responses gradually transformed into moral system that inverted these responses, celebrating restraint over expression, meekness over strength, forgiveness over retaliation. The specific theological details changed across religious history, but the basic psychological mechanism remained consistent. Forgiveness functioned as sophisticated moral inversion that transformed natural disadvantage into spiritual advantage through values that privilege our psychological states naturally available to those without direct power. This cultural evolution wasn't driven by malicious intent, but by the psychological needs of particular human condition. As Nietzsche writes in Beyond Good and Evil, the master's morality springs from a triumphant affirmation of themselves, while the slave's morality from a denial of a powerful enemy, one who is other than themselves. This denial is a creative act from the beginning. This isn't mere historical observation, but recognition that moral systems evolve to serve particular psychological needs, especially the need to transform condition that cannot be changed through direct action into virtue that can be celebrated through moral inversion. What makes this pattern particularly compelling is how it manifests across seemingly different aspects of Western culture. Religious institutions celebrate forgiveness as supreme virtue, while simultaneously creating framework of moral accounting, where pardon functions as sophisticated form of credit and debt. Educational systems often perpetuate the psychological patterns established by this moral framework. Therapeutic approaches sometimes reinforce rather than challenge the transformation of natural human responses into their apparent opposites through sophisticated psychological mechanisms. Each domain develops its own language, but the basic pattern often remains consistent: the conversion of direct responses into their moral inversions that privilege psychological states naturally available to those without direct power. The conspiracy extends into how we conceptualize personal development itself, often framing it as increasing cultivation of virtues like forgiveness, rather than honest acknowledgement of natural human responses. It appears in how we approach reconciliation, frequently emphasizing moral obligation over authentic healing. It emerges in how we understand spiritual growth, commonly defining it in terms of virtuous restraint rather than genuine strength. The pattern persists. Human healing continues to be framed largely through psychological mechanisms established by traditional morality, even in seemingly secular contexts. What makes this pattern so powerful isn't any single manifestation, but its remarkable adaptability across diverse cultural contexts. As traditional Christian theology loses cultural authority in certain contexts, the same basic psychological mechanism often continues through secular forms. The transformation of natural human responses into their apparent opposites without explicit religious language, the disguising of resentment behind seemingly virtuous release, the moral elevation that positions itself above others precisely by claiming to forgive them. Different conceptual details, same basic psychological mechanism. The transformation of weakness into moral superiority through sophisticated inversion that privileges psychological states naturally available to those without direct power. Nietzsche's penetrating insight wasn't merely that Christian forgiveness disguises resentment, but that this psychological pattern persists even as specific theological content evolves. That behind diverse approaches to virtue often lurks the same basic psychological mechanism. The transformation of natural human responses into their apparent opposites through moral framework that inverts power relationships. The real conspiracy isn't specific theological content, but the deeper cultural pattern of transforming direct responses into their moral inversions, process that effectively converts natural human reactions into a sophisticated system of spiritual credit and debt disguised as virtue. This pattern raises profound questions about forgiveness, resentment, and the possibility of authentic healing beyond the moral inversions of traditional virtue. If conventional pardon functions primarily as disguised form of moral superiority, what might become possible if we sought genuine overcoming beyond the sophisticated transaction of traditional forgiveness? What form of reconciliation might emerge if we distinguished between authentic healing and the moral credit disguised as virtue that characterizes its traditional formulation? As we continue our investigation, we'll explore why this pattern has remained largely unacknowledged and what it might mean for the possibility of authentic overcoming beyond the disguised resentment of conventional forgiveness. Why has the disguised resentment of Christian forgiveness remained largely unacknowledged despite its profound influence on Western morality? The answer isn't a conscious cover-up, but rather a collective investment in maintaining the appearance that forgiveness represents genuine liberation rather than sophisticated form of moral superiority. Addressing this pattern would mean questioning not just specific theological details, but the very psychological foundations of our most celebrated virtue. A prospect simultaneously liberating and threatening to both individuals and institutions built around traditional moral frameworks. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche offers a penetrating insight into this collective avoidance. The falseness of a judgment is not necessarily an objection to a judgment. The question is to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. This passage reveals Nietzsche's recognition that beliefs persist not primarily because of their truth value, but because of their psychological utility. And few psychological mechanisms are more useful for those without direct power than the moral inversion that transforms weakness into virtue. By maintaining the appearance that forgiveness represents genuine liberation rather than disguised form of moral superiority, we avoid confronting the disturbing possibility that our most celebrated virtue might emerge from psychological mechanisms quite different from their explicit claims. Religious institutions have an obvious stake in maintaining the appearance that forgiveness represents genuine liberation rather than disguised form of moral superiority. Their authority depends fundamentally on their claim to promote authentic reconciliation rather than sophisticated psychological compensation, to cultivate genuine healing rather than inverted resentment that positions itself above others precisely by claiming to forgive them. Acknowledging the disguised moral superiority of conventional forgiveness would undermine this foundational claim, challenging not just specific theological details, but the very psychological basis of religious virtue. It's not that religious leaders consciously suppress this insight, but rather that their entire framework depends on maintaining the appearance that forgiveness represents genuine liberation rather than disguised form of moral superiority. Cultural narratives reinforce this pattern by consistently portraying forgiveness as genuine healing rather than sophisticated psychological mechanism. From religious education to popular culture, dominant stories present conventional pardon as authentic reconciliation rather than disguised form of moral superiority, as genuine release rather than inverted resentment that positions itself above others precisely by claiming to forgive them. It's not a conscious conspiracy, but rather the natural evolution of cultural narratives that benefit from maintaining the appearance that traditional virtue promotes authentic healing rather than sophisticated psychological compensation. Educational systems often perpetuate this pattern by teaching children that forgiveness represents genuine liberation rather than disguised form of moral superiority. As Nietzsche writes in Human, All Too Human, Christianity wants to destroy, shatter, stun, intoxicate. There is only one thing that it does not want: moderation, and for this reason, it is in its deepest meaning barbaric, Asiatic, ignoble, un-Greek. This provocative passage reveals how moral education might serve not just to transmit specific ethical content, but to maintain the appearance that traditional virtue promotes authentic reconciliation rather than sophisticated psychological compensation, that forgiveness represents genuine liberation rather than disguised form of moral superiority. Perhaps most significantly, this pattern remains unacknowledged because addressing it would mean confronting what Nietzsche called the death of God, not merely questioning specific religious beliefs, but recognizing how thoroughly Western morality has been shaped by psychological mechanisms that transform natural human responses into their apparent opposites through sophisticated moral inversions. This prospect is so challenging that many prefer the familiar comfort of conventional virtue to the more demanding terrain of authentic healing beyond the disguised resentment of traditional forgiveness. The pattern persists not through conscious suppression, but through the simple human preference for comforting moral narratives over disturbing psychological insights, for virtues that transform natural responses into their apparent opposites, over honest acknowledgement of human reactions beyond religious framework, and for reconciliation defined through traditional concepts over authentic healing, beyond the disguised resentment of conventional forgiveness. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. This isn't mere atheistic declaration, but profound cultural observation. Even as the psychological foundations of traditional virtue become increasingly questionable, moral systems continue displaying the shadow of these foundations, the conceptual remnants of psychological mechanisms whose actual function remains largely unacknowledged. What does this mean for the possibility of authentic healing beyond the disguised resentment of conventional forgiveness? If traditional virtue often functions as sophisticated psychological compensation rather than genuine liberation, what might become possible if we sought authentic reconciliation beyond the moral framework that transforms natural human responses into their apparent opposites? What form of overcoming might emerge if we distinguished between genuine healing and the disguised moral superiority that characterizes its traditional formulation? As we approach our final exploration, we'll examine what Nietzsche's discovery reveals about the possibility of authentic overcoming beyond the disguised resentment of conventional forgiveness, not through rejection of reconciliation, but through honest acknowledgement of human responses beyond the moral inversions that transform natural reactions into their apparent opposites. The final question isn't whether reconciliation is valuable, but whether conventional forgiveness represents genuine healing or disguised form of moral superiority. Nietzsche's discovery reveals something profound about Christian psychology, how consistently this celebrated virtue functions as sophisticated mechanism for transforming harm into moral credit, offense into spiritual leverage, inability to respond directly into power to dominate through different means. But it also reveals something even more significant, the possibility of authentic overcoming beyond the disguised resentment of conventional virtue, not through rejection of reconciliation, but through honest acknowledgement of human responses beyond the moral inversions that transform natural reactions into their apparent opposites. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this possibility through his concept of the overman, not a superior being in the crude biological sense, but a way of approaching life beyond the psychological mechanisms of traditional morality. I teach you the overman. Man is something that shall be overcome. This isn't rejection of reconciliation, but recognition that authentic healing might emerge beyond the disguised resentment of conventional forgiveness, not through moral superiority disguised as virtuous pardon, but through genuine strength that doesn't need to forgive because it has actually moved beyond. This isn't about embracing vindictiveness or rejecting reconciliation, but transforming how we understand these concepts, recognizing that authentic healing might emerge not through conventional forgiveness, but through honest acknowledgement of human responses beyond religious framework. Perhaps the truly reconciled person isn't one who performs moral act of pardoning from position of spiritual superiority, but one who has genuinely moved beyond the offense without need for transaction or recognition, not through virtues that transform natural responses into their apparent opposites, but through authentic strength that truly leaves injury behind. What might this look like in practice? It means examining your relationship to conventional forgiveness, noticing when it functions not as genuine liberation, but as disguised form of moral superiority. It means asking whether your conception of reconciliation emerges from authentic healing or from moral framework that transforms natural responses into their apparent opposites. It means recognizing when you use phrases like, "I forgive you," not to express genuine release, but to establish subtle form of moral credit that positions you above the forgiven. It means developing approach to reconciliation beyond the disguised resentment of conventional virtue, not through rejection of healing, but through honest acknowledgement of human responses beyond the moral framework that transforms natural reactions into their apparent opposites. It means approaching harm not primarily through religious obligation to forgive, but through authentic engagement with both injury and potential healing. It means recognizing the possibility of genuine overcoming that doesn't require either moral transaction or acknowledgement of spiritual credit. Most importantly, it means understanding that liberation from the disguised resentment of conventional forgiveness doesn't require rejection of reconciliation. That authentic healing might emerge precisely through honest acknowledgement of human responses beyond the moral framework that transforms natural reactions into their apparent opposites. This isn't abandonment of reconciliation, but its transformation. Relationship to harm beyond the psychological mechanisms that convert offense into opportunity for moral credit disguised as virtue. The path forward isn't about rejecting healing, but liberating reconciliation from the disguised resentment of conventional virtue. Whether within traditional spiritual frameworks or beyond them, authentic overcoming requires distinguishing between genuine healing and the sophisticated moral transaction disguised as forgiveness, between direct engagement with harm and the psychological mechanism that transforms offense into opportunity for spiritual credit through moral bookkeeping. What might become possible if you distinguished between genuine healing and the disguised resentment of conventional forgiveness? What form of reconciliation might emerge beyond the moral framework that transforms natural human responses into their apparent opposites? What relationship to harm might you discover beyond the psychological mechanisms that convert offense into opportunity for moral credit disguised as virtue? The answer to these questions won't come from more perfect cultivation of conventional forgiveness, but from honest acknowledgement of human responses beyond the moral inversions of traditional virtue. As Nietzsche suggests, authentic reconciliation begins precisely where conventional forgiveness ends, with recognition that forgiveness is the secret pleasure of one who never forgets the offense. Perhaps the most profound insight isn't that reconciliation lacks value, but that authentic healing emerges beyond the disguised resentment of conventional virtue, and that genuine overcoming doesn't require moral transaction disguised as forgiveness, but actually leaving the offense behind without need for spiritual bookkeeping or moral positioning. The real journey isn't perfecting conventional forgiveness, but discovering authentic healing beyond the disguised resentment of traditional virtue. Perhaps as Nietzsche discovered, the most liberating truth of all is that those who truly need to forgive have not yet overcome. They've merely changed strategies.